Welcome to Motherhood in ADHD. I'm your friend, Patricia Sen. My mission is to be a lighthouse for mothers with ADHD, helping you find your path to success by learning to appreciate your ADHD as an asset. I'm seeking to change the paradigm that ADHD means your life is doomed to be a hot mess. So I'm sharing strategies and encouraging you in your pursuit of happiness to love who you are every day of your ADHD life. Hey there, successful mama. It is your friend Patricia. Perfectionism. Dun, dun, dun. Isn't this how we all feel about perfectionism? We hear the dramatic soundtrack in the background, and we know that it's looming, and yet somehow we don't know what to do with it. It is my opinion that perfectionism is an epidemic among ADHD women. There are so many women struggling, trying to make things quote unquote perfect so that they can overcome the struggle inside their brain, and they don't even know that what their struggle is ADHD, that they can put a name to it and they can know there's nothing wrong with me. My brain is just different. And that's part of why I started this podcast. One of the questions I always ask myself is, how do I help all of these women who are struggling and don't even know that there is a definition, a medical diagnosis that explains why their brain is so all over the place? There are so many of us that have unrealistic expectations of what we should be doing. And perfectionism is a coping mechanism that we learned as girls or young women to overcome our ADHD and the struggle. And how many times we heard the phrase, well, if you would just work harder, if you would just pay more attention, then you would be or do what everyone else was expecting of you. And I'm going to get on a soapbox here. So I got to rein it in a little because I'm very passionate about this topic. But I want to focus on the fact that there is hope. The last few episodes, we've been talking about lessons from therapy. So I've been sharing what I have learned in the last few weeks with my therapist. And recently we've been delving into perfectionism, which is a huge problem for me. It's a big problem. So before I dig into what she taught me, I have to say my disclaimer of, I am not a therapist. I am not a counselor or a psychiatrist or a psychologist or any of those fancy doctor helper people with certificates from important places. I have a degree, it's in business and Spanish, but this is not my background by trade. I want to share with you what I learned in therapy because I know that therapy is not an option for everyone. I think it is so valuable, and I hope that in these last few episodes you will learn enough that you feel like this is something that's worth it for you to do if you need that help. But I also recognize that therapy is really expensive and it's very time consuming. So at least I can share what I've learned with you, and hopefully you can get a good starting point and get some changes made in your life on the way that you think about things and the way that you approach your struggles. And hopefully there is a point where you can find someone who is the right fit for you and maybe even takes your insurance, and that you can grow even more. But until then, you're stuck with me. So let's jump in to what I learned about perfectionism in therapy. So my doctor gave me this handout that she'd put together, and it's based on the book called When Perfect Isn't Good Enough, Strategies for Coping with Perfectionism. And it's by Marty Antony and Richard Swanson. And I'll link this in the show notes. So if you want to go back and look it up later, you do not need to remember that. If you aren't sure how to get to show notes, just head over to my website. In the resources tab, you'll see a button for show notes, and you can read all the links of things that I have ever mentioned on a podcast. Unless I forgot them, then you should send me a note and I will go add it in. Well, the first point that I had to learn, which sounds really dumb because obviously I already know this, but to really thoroughly absorb it and feel it is just, it's hard. Like, I wish I had a better word for it, but it's just so hard. And that is understanding that perfectionism strives for unrealistic ideals and goals that cannot be accomplished. Knowing that no matter how hard I try, I will never achieve perfect. It is literally not possible, even if I put every ounce of effort, time, blood, sweat, tears into something. I will never make it perfect because that is just not possible. Now, I can get really close, but I'm never going to get 100% there. So in reminding myself that, she had me write down the pros and cons of being perfect. And so I want you to do this too, along with me. Now, keep in mind that all of this information that I'm sharing with you is over several weeks in therapy. So you are not going to solve your perfectionism issues in the next 24 to 48 hours. However, you can work on them over time. And so the first thing she had me do was to write down the pros and cons of being perfect. So for example, my pros were things like I get things done. If it's really well done, I'm less stressed about the product. And then the cons for me are things like, then I end up spending too much time on something, or I get really frustrated that it's not going exactly how I want it. So first, write down your list of why you love perfectionism, and then why perfectionism is not that great. The second thing I learned is that perfectionism is self-oriented, but it's created from socially prescribed behaviors. What does that mean? So when you take on the attributes of being a perfectionist, you in your head come up with what do you need to do in order to achieve things perfectly. So you create your own set of lists, your own set of requirements of what you have to do to achieve perfect. Now, where do you get these ideas from? That's the socially prescribed part. There's something along the way within you received information from your family or from your peers or from school that this is the way we're supposed to be. And then you take those attributes and you internalize them and you turn them into something more. You make them more stringent. You make them more exact. You take your own spin on them, I guess you could say. So like pulling from my past, if I say, I would get a lot of comments on my homework or report cards that I was making a lot of careless mistakes. So I received the information from society that I'm not supposed to be making careless mistakes, which it was their view of careless. I actually was trying hard. I wasn't doing those out of carelessness. Obviously, that was my ADHD working. But then I would take that beyond the issue of careless, quote unquote, careless mistakes. And I was taking it into a view of like, I can't make mistakes. Like no, adjective in front of just, I can't make mistakes. So I would then go and proofread things 47 times to make sure that it was exactly perfect. So the next step there is to just think about what are the ideas you had received as a kid that may have driven you to take these things too far. How did we manipulate these requirements to put too high of expectations on ourselves? So for me, it really helped to recognize where I drew incorrect conclusions on how a socially prescribed behavior was supposed to be, and then turning it into something unhealthy for me. Now, you don't have to solve all of your childhood issues in this process. I'm just saying for me, in some of the things, it just made it easier to process through if I could identify things along the way. Now, this is also not a place to place blame on anyone, because when you're getting this kind of information, even as an adult, but when you're like an 8-year-old, you don't realize the filter that you view things through. So this isn't a blame statement. I'm just recognizing mistakes were made, and I wish it had been better communicated to me as a child. But I can realize now that when I would get comments on my report cards like, Patricia makes careless mistakes, it's easy for me to look back now and see why they said that and how it all turned into a big mess. And I can go back and say, well, I wish they had said, Patricia should check her work more thoroughly before turning in items, because the word careless has such a negative connotation to it. It was making it sound like I was doing it on purpose. I didn't have care. That's not true. That wasn't the issue. The issue is the way that my brain functions. But I can't go back and change that. So I need to just let that go. I don't want to point fingers. That doesn't get me anywhere now. What I do want to recognize is what I can change. And what I can change is say, I understand that when people would tell me that I made careless mistakes, I would internalize that as I was being careless, even though I thought I was taking pretty good care to make sure I was doing it correctly. And that made me care even more, which was like an over caring. So putting in too much worry, too much concern into being exact and making it perfect. So I see where the disaster occurred, because I didn't get why I was making quote unquote careless mistakes when I felt like I was taking so much care to make it correct, that I then invented that statement into, oh, well, I think I'm just not supposed to make any mistakes, because I didn't understand the breakdown between their version of careless and in my head how that didn't add up. So in summary, I'm not placing blame because I can't go back and change the past, but what I can do is understand this is where that stems from, and going back and unraveling that tangly mess to say it's not about me not making mistakes. It's that they thought they knew what the answer was. They thought I just needed to try harder at this. And so that's what they were encouraging me to do. And I need to go back and say, okay, I understand that the message wasn't don't make any mistakes. The message was check your work more. So I'm going to focus on the solution for things and how I can make that a healthy way of checking versus an unhealthy obsession with making things perfect. And then I really had to think about how I'm on high alert all the time. And that's a really stressful way to live, because I was always worried about things not being good enough. And it's just not a healthy place for me to be in that high anxiety, high stress position all the time. So next thing I looked at is, where are my struggles? Where is this perfectionism causing me issues? Or what other issues do I have that are making the perfectionism harder? So for me, some of those are prioritizing. Prioritizing is very difficult for me. That makes it harder to get things done in the right timeline or correctly, and it makes everything wonky. Another struggle I have is a lack of flexibility. Because I know that I can do things this way, ABC, and they will be done well, I'm not good at adjusting that if I don't have the time to do all 3 steps or fully complete the cycle. I don't have the ability to modify on the fly. For us perfectionists, flexibility is a learned skill. I don't know about you, but I always felt so nervous about things not going well that once I found a way that did work, that was the way I was going to do it every time. Now, in and of itself, that's a good thing. But on the flip side, life isn't perfect. It's not always predictable. It doesn't always go the same way. And so sometimes you have to do things a different way. However, I struggle with the fact that when I do it a different way, then things don't go well. And that makes me even want to stand firmer in doing it the way that I used to do it. But then that would also increase the mindset of, if I try to do things a different way, it's going to fail. Also reinforcing that I should still do them the same way that I always did them, because the risk was just too much. So we'll talk about how to overcome that in a minute, but let me stay on track. And then going along with that, I get stuck when things change. I just can't choose what's next because I'd already decided I'm going to do these 5 things in a row. If all of a sudden 2 gets messed up and I can't do 3, I didn't know how to adjust to still be able to get 4 and 5 done, or to do 2 and 3 in a different way, because that's part of having ADHD, is that I'm not good at reorganizing on the fly with my perfectionism, because my perfectionism is my coping skill for ADHD. I know that if I do it exactly this way, I can mitigate the issues along with my ADHD, and that's what keeps me in line. So I know that doing it this way is going to bring me success. So trying to do it a different way gets very overwhelming and frustrating. And I find it interesting because in some ways, ADHD makes us very good at dealing with things on the fly. And in other ways, it makes it very difficult. So I always love to bring out the nuances in that kind of thing, because some people think all ADHD people can always think on the fly. And that's not true. It depends on the person, on the situation, on what plans were already made, what the environment is. There's just so much that goes into it. So thinking well on the fly is both something that people with ADHD are very good at, and also something that we're not good at, depending on the situation. So go ahead and think about what other struggles you have in your perfectionism and write down as many as you can. Our next step was writing my eulogy. I know, wah wah, super bummer. But this gives you a chance to think about what really is important to you. What are your values? What are your priorities? When you're dead, nobody's going to sit there and talk about how your tablescapes were so gorgeous whenever you hosted something at your house. what they're going to talk about is how welcoming you are, how you invited the whole neighborhood in, how you shared whatever you had, whether it was a lot or a little, with whoever walked in your door. So understanding the priority of when I'm hosting something, it's not about how beautiful the dishes look or the decorations that I put up or that I made this 25-course meal with 7 appetizers, blah, blah, blah. It matters that I welcome people into my home and that I shared with them and I made them feel loved while they were in my space. So just that eulogy mindset really makes you focus on, what do I want people to remember me by? Do I really care that they remember that my emails were always perfectly spell checked? Like, let's look in the grand scheme of things, And then once I think about that mindset of like, what really are my priorities and values, to then look at what are my standards, because my standards can be very black and white and perfection driven. So for example, if I write an email, I want it to be perfect. I don't want any misspellings. I don't want any grammar mistakes. But the amount of time that I put into fixing that is a little ridiculous. So my homework was rewriting my standards in a slightly less stringent way. Now, this is really hard to do, so I'm going to give you my example, but it takes a little bit to kind of get the hang of. So instead of saying I have to send the perfect email, I rewrote it to say sending a well-crafted email is valuable. So I'm taking out the must have, should language, and I'm pointing out the benefits, but I'm not making it like a hard have to statement. Okay. So another one would be, I should always have a plan. And I can rewrite that as a plan is very helpful. So while I would like to have a plan and it's very helpful to me, I'm also not going to die with a plan. Am I very unhappy about it? Yes, I am working on that mindset for sure. But knowing that I don't have to have the plan, that I can view it just as an accoutrement to my day, that is a much healthier mindset than saying I have to have it. So write down some of your standards. Think about a way that you could word them so that they're not quite so harsh. How can you make them still valid? Yes, a plan is very helpful, but it's not that have to, should, must language in there. And then once you think about those priorities, then look at it through the lens of, are these things that I want to pass along to my kids? Do I want them to take this advice to heart? I am a 1 on the Enneagram, if you're familiar with that, which means I am already like driven from the inside on wanting to be good, wanting to do things well. I have an underlying fear of being bad, messing things up, people seeing me as amoral or looking at the reason that I did things in a shady light, when a lot of times I speak from the heart, not to upset people, but I still speak the truth. And it really cuts me to the core when I feel like somebody takes what I said and construes it into like me being hurtful to the person receiving it. That's a struggle for me. So I feel like this is kind of like doubling down on my perfectionism, because I basically took my core being of who I am and how I approach things. And then when you throw in the want to control the situation and try to control my ADHD before I knew what it was, right? The ways that I wanted to control how it affected me, that's where I delved into the perfectionism as a coping mechanism. Now, the reason I'm talking about this now in terms of what I want to pass along to my kids, is that I see those same tendencies in my oldest. Now, my youngest is very like laissez-faire. My oldest is also a perfectionist already. I mean, you could tell when he was like 2, he would line up his cars in exactly the same row, and knowing that that's a driving factor for him too. This is something I really take to heart, is that I don't want him to use perfectionism as a coping mechanism as well. And so I find myself giving him the advice that I wish someone had said to me. And to be honest, maybe my parents did say this to me and maybe I didn't listen. I don't know. If you're not familiar, my mom passed away when I was younger. And so I can't go back and ask her and be like, hey, did you try to tell me not to do this? Who knows? And my dad was not like a touchy-feely kind of guy. He's an engineer. So I don't think he would have skewed me away from perfectionism, because he is just a very like straight and narrow kind of guy. But also, my dad doesn't remember a lot of our childhood nuances. And, I feel like that's the beauty of parenthood, is that you forget how hard it was And that's why grandparents never understand when you're like frustrated with your kids, because in their head, you were the perfect angel and everything was roses 90% of the time. So I really feel like that's the beauty of the way God created parents, because this is a hard job, y'all. And if we remembered how hard it was all the time, no one would ever have any more kids. All right, going back on track. So the point of this was, think about those standards and what you want to pass along to your kids. How do you want them to take this advice? How do you want them to grow and learn and be better? If you are being super hard on yourself and you wouldn't even say that to your kids, then you need to give yourself that same grace. So mamas, we begin with understanding, learning about our perfectionism, identifying the faulty beliefs that I have, and begin rewriting them. It is a process to rewrite your internal soundtrack, but the more you do it, the quicker you will notice when you start heading into what Brené Brown calls the shame spiral, or maybe for you, it's an anxious spiral or the stressful spiral, whatever feelings you get when you're losing control of what's going on. How does the perfectionism manifest in your brain? Once we've got a handle on that, and I'm not saying being an expert, just an understanding, right? That's our goal here, understanding our perfectionism. Then we can start putting things into action. And that's what we will talk about next week. So I will talk to you then, successful mama. Have an amazing week. Hey mama, did you know that I have a website? It's motherhoodinadhd.com. On there you can learn how to connect with me. I've got my favorite resources listed there, as well as show notes for every podcast episode. So if you want to know where to find anything I've talked about, it's there in the show notes. Come check it out. Thank you for listening to Motherhood in ADHD. For more resources, head over to our website, www.motherhoodinadhd.com.